Hi, welcome to Tweed Salvos. My name's John, and you are joining us in our second week on a series on the book of Nehemiah. Now, last week we looked at the life of a man from the Old Testament of the Bible called Nehemiah, who was used by God to lead the people of Israel in the task of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Now, this event happened at a time when the captivity of the Jews had already come to an end. They were allowed to return to Israel and to rebuild their nation. And many Jews had returned, and they began to resettle in the villages in Israel. However, because of the constant opposition from their enemies who lived around them, the progress of rebuilding the city of Jerusalem was actually really slowed down, and the outer walls of the city were still in ruins. But in the year 445 BC, 94 years after the Jews were allowed to return, God raised up a man, this man, Nehemiah, to do the work of rebuilding the walls. And he was a high-ranking Jewish official who lived in the royal Persian court. And in last week's message, Nicole took a look at Nehemiah chapter 1 and reminded us about the rubble that the Jewish nation faced. And the rubble was not only the broken down parts of the walls around their city, but it also described the broken down aspects of their lives where they felt demoralised and worthless. It reflected the way that their community behaved. So Nicole used the first chapter of Nehemiah to teach us, don't resign yourself to live in the rubble. You're not the broken down parts of your life. That's not your identity. It's not where you need to resign yourself to live. You are God's chosen people. So live like it. Live in the victory of your life and share that with your community. And then she reminded us to allow yourself to be wrecked by the rubble. Allow God to break your heart for what breaks His, to see the broken down things and then be filled with His love and compassion for those things and those people. And finally, allow God to use you to rebuild the rubble. We all have a part to play in the rebuilding of those broken down things. And that's where we pick up Nehemiah's story in chapter 2. We see that after about 4 months, his prayers were finally answered when the Persian king gave him permission to go to Jerusalem. Nehemiah then came to Jerusalem, and after making a thorough survey of the walls at night, he gathered all the Jewish leaders all the Jews together and shared with them his burden for building the walls. What he said to them challenged them so effectively that without any hesitation at all, they all said in chapter 2, verse 18, let's rise up and build. Now, this kind of thing really resonates with us as Salvos. We're a practical people. We see something in need and we address it. We find ways to address things that need to be done. We see somebody hurting and we ask, how can we help them find healing? Throughout the Salvos history, we've been seen as practical Christians, which is why so many people say that the Salvos are Christianity with their sleeves rolled up. And it's one of the things that we encourage William Booth to share the words that, while women weep as they do now, I'll fight. While people go to prison, while people are hungry, while there's one lost person, I'll fight. It's a faith that holds on to the point that Nicole finished with in last week's message. Allow God to use you to rebuild the rubble. See the broken down things and allow God to use you to help rebuild them. And today, as we study Nehemiah chapter 2, we're going to look at 3 steps that we ought to take to do the Lord's work well. 1, initiate prayerfully. 2, investigate carefully. And 3, invigorate hopefully. Now that first one, initiate prayerfully. There is a significant time jump between Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 1 and chapter 2 verse 1. Now Nehemiah chapter 1, the words of Nehemiah, son of Helekah, in the month of Kislev in the 20th year. And then in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1, in the month of Nisan. Nisan and Kislev are 4 months apart. If Nehemiah had been so deeply moved to weep and pray about the broken state of Jerusalem, why then did he take 4 months to ask the king about it? Well, the passage of Scripture doesn't provide any reason for the delay, but perhaps the king was away from the palace throughout all the time. Perhaps Nehemiah was not only the cupbearer to the Persian court, but he had to wait his time. He had to wait his turn to serve the wine to the king. Or perhaps Nehemiah was just waiting for the right moment to take action. This isn't actually hesitation on his part, but actually wisdom. He certainly wouldn't want to make his approach when Artaxerxes wasn't in the right frame of mind or spirit, or to do something to jeopardize his request. But after 4 months of prayer, the golden opportunity finally came unexpectedly when Nehemiah was serving the king. And the king noticed that Nehemiah wasn't his usual self. And so he questioned him about this in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 2. So the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of a heart. I was very much afraid." And there is good reason for Nehemiah to be freaking out at this. Because according to ancient Persian records, regardless of somebody's problems, everyone in the royal court was expected to display a cheerful countenance in the king's presence. The slightest show of sadness before the king could actually arouse suspicions that they're unhappy with the king himself and may actually be a threat. And because of this, Nehemiah had to do his best to conceal his sadness from the king. And he'd managed to do that for the past 4 months of praying. But as he's prayed to God, he's been wrecked with his heart for the rubble. That he'd left, that was this rubble that was left in his homeland, and he actually can't hold on to it any longer. And then he says to the king in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 3, "May the king live long forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" This is actually a really bold statement. He just lays it out there knowing that he's sought God over this for months and his sad face has actually opened the door. I think that verse 4 is the real key here, where he says, "The king said to me, 'What is it that you want?' Then I prayed to the God of heaven." Nehemiah had been praying 4 months for a solution to rebuilding the rubble of the Jewish city walls, and he gets his opportunity. The king asks what he wants, and he prays again. It was probably a very short, silent prayer that Nehemiah made in his heart, in which he may have asked God to give him wisdom and courage to say the right thing and to give him favour in the sight of the king. It's a basic lesson and also an important one. To do anything well, initiate prayerfully. Seek God's help first. Honest question. How much do you depend on God to help you in your daily life? Do you always begin each day with prayer? When you're at your job, do you turn to God in prayer when you face a problem in the workplace? As a student, do you pray for help before or support before you start an exam or before you start studying? During our Kindness Connections holiday program here at Tweed Salvos, we make sure that we pray for travelling mercies for a fun time and a safe time, safe travel to and from wherever we go, before we even turn the bus on. If we want to do what God is asking of us well. We need to learn to be like Nehemiah, always ready to shoot off a sincere prayer from the heart at any time, in any place, and in the midst of any activity, besides the regular times of prayer that we have set aside for the Lord. This applies to every aspect of living by faith, whether you're out there evangelizing in your streets, growing deeper in your relationship with Jesus, or delivering furniture from the family store. Every facet of faith and service has its own unique set of needs and difficulties. But for years, many Jesus followers would testify that things begin to change when they set their hearts to pray. They see God working in marvelous ways that they've never imagined. And so, whenever you're involved in some new work for Jesus, ensure that you initiate it prayerfully. Seek the Lord's help before doing anything. That's what Nehemiah did. And the results were really encouraging. He testifies in chapter 2, verse 8. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. Initiate prayerfully. Then investigate carefully. After the king gave Nehemiah permission to go, Nehemiah packed up and he was out of there for this long journey to his homeland. Once he got there, news of his arrival spread pretty fast, and the letters that he had from the king identified him as a Persian official who'd been sent for the welfare of the Jews. Now, of course, arriving with Persian papers in your homeland is going to naturally arouse ill feelings among some of the enemies of the Jews. And two of those are named Sanballat and Tobiah. 3 days after he arrived, Nehemiah carried out this survey on the walls, and he did it at night because of these enemies and because they knew he was there. So he did it at night when everyone was asleep in order to avoid any unhelpful attention. In fact, according to verse 12, he only took a few trusted men and a mule to ride on, probably to minimize the noise. And as Nehemiah went around the city to see for himself the rubble of the broken down walls of Jerusalem, what he found was a huge job. That every part of the wall was broken down and every gate had been burnt. It was not going to be an easy task to restore it to what it once was. And it was certainly not a job he could do on his own. If we're going to do the Lord's work well, we need to investigate carefully. We're made in the image of God, and therefore He's filled us with an ability to receive and use His wisdom. If we want to do what the Lord has called us to, and we want to do that successfully, we need to pray over it and then be smart about it. Jesus Himself taught in Luke chapter 14, verses 28 to 30, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay a foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. Now, in the context of Luke 14, Jesus is talking about discipleship. When you make a commitment to follow Christ, did you count the cost? Did you take the time to consider carefully what inconveniences and sacrifices you might have to bear as a follower of Christ? It always pays to count the cost and investigate carefully before we do anything. Nehemiah did that before he shared his plans with the leaders of the community, and the results were very encouraging. And this brings us to our third step that we ought to take to do the Lord's work well. Invigorate hopefully. When Nehemiah completed his careful investigation, he must have known that it was not going to be easy to motivate the leadership of the Jewish people to rebuild the walls. I mean, it had been 94 years and they still hadn't built it. This isn't the first time that anyone had tried to do this. I mean, several attempts had been made over those years since the time that the Jews had returned from captivity, but all of them had failed. They would need motivations that are strong enough to believe that they will succeed this time. So Nehemiah gathered together all of the local Jewish leaders and then challenged them in chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. Then he said to them, "You see the trouble we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burnt with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. There are three things here that we need to remember for ourselves when we're encouraging others to follow Jesus. Number one, what's the reality? Nehemiah didn't sugarcoat things. He laid it on the line. This place is in ruins. What's the reality? Number two, what could be? He showed them a way out. The people were demoralized, but he reminded them, because he says, let us, he reminds them that together they can shake off this disgrace. And three, who is with them? Nehemiah is testifying to what God has done. These people have been living in the rubble of their city and the broken down condition of their walls and their lives for years. That's all that's filling their vision. But here's Nehemiah with a current testimony that God still loves his people, that he still wants to help his people, and that he has the power to help restore his people. Nehemiah's testimony fills them with hope that encourages them enough so that they shout at the end of verse 18. And they replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. We follow a God of hope. A Christian writer by the name of Henry Newen once said, "Hope makes you see God's guiding hand, not only in the gentle and pleasing moments, but also in the shadows of disappointment and darkness." Romans chapter 15 verse 13 says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in Him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." Whether it's a pleasant moment or facing darkness, filled with hope, we can do so much more than face it. We can rise up and build. Just imagine what it would be like if we all had the same determination for the Lord's work that these people had after they'd heard from Nehemiah. If we really mean business in our commitment to God, the needs of His kingdom should be our concern as well. We would desire to do something about them. We wouldn't sit content just to wait for something to happen, but instead we would take the initiative and do something to meet those needs. We would have the same spirit as Nehemiah and those leaders who said, "Let us rise up and build." But when we commit ourselves to meeting the needs of God's kingdom, we sometimes find ourselves facing darkness, those difficulties, find that it's demanding and that it can be quite discouraging because of all the hindrances and opposition that we're bound to face when we're going against the grain of what the world is expecting from us. You can be sure that when you do God's work, there will always be difficulties and opposition. And that's exactly what Nehemiah and the Jewish leaders faced soon after they'd got started. Because we read in chapter 2 verse that when their enemies had officially heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed them, saying, "What is this that you're doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" The ones who are mentioned in this verse later gave plenty of opposition in various ways. They made false accusations against Nehemiah. They even went as far to actually arm themselves and show aggression. They certainly made the task of building the wall much more difficult than it already was. How could the people hope to build the wall with such opposition against them? Well, it's only by the dependence on the God that came to help them. This is the best hope that we can have in our work. Verse 20 says, I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. A missionary to China by the name of Hudson Taylor once said, God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. In other words, the success of God's work is always guaranteed by God himself. It is with this wonderful hope that we can rise up and build his kingdom across the gospel endeavour of our church. We need to do God's work. And when we do that, we must have a constant dependence on him to prosper us. God alone will see us through every seemingly impossible situation. God alone will provide us all the help that we need. And God alone will assure our hearts of victory when we face opposition to his work. How greatly, therefore, do we need to trust him? It's my prayer for us that just as the Jews had been invigorated by Nehemiah to rise up and rebuild the broken walls of Jerusalem, that our hearts will now be invigorated by Jesus to rise up and rebuild the broken walls of his church, the broken connections in our communities, and the broken lives of his people. Maybe Jesus is even calling you to rise up and rebuild the broken walls of your own spiritual life. The God that made the way for Nehemiah is the same God that is here for us today to support us in the difficulties that we face, to encourage us in the task that he's given us, to show us the rubble that needs to be rebuilt. Today, pray that his Spirit would fill you, that you would know what to do as you investigate his will and then step out in the knowledge that you will overflow with his hope and power and love. May that hope and power and love overflow in you today. God bless you.